Hi, guys. What I want to do today is we want to talk about Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase and a couple of things. One, to understand the United States, I think and we've talked about this before, you kind of got to have an understanding of Thomas Jefferson, kind of a paradox in American history. The guy that writes the Declaration of Independence also owns slaves on his plantation at Monticello. The president who was staunchly a strict constructionist, meaning that you followed the Constitution word by word, purchases Louisiana, probably really pushing the bounds of what is constitutional by making that purchase. So, a transformative person in American history who then makes probably the most important purchases in American history. So, what I'd like to do is actually just go over some of these questions with you guys regarding the Lewis and Clark expedition, and then you can use these to build as you go through the PowerPoint. But once Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase, he had his secretary and in many ways his protege Meriwether Lewis, along with Lewis's close friend William Clark, lead the expedition across the western third of the United States, the upper Missouri River region, to the Rocky Mountains, to the Pacific Ocean in Oregon. Primarily, what they really wanted, what Jefferson was really hoping, is that there was a Northwest Passageway. There's always been a thought, there was always a hope, even in the early exploration period, that there was some kind of waterway that went across the continent of North America, that went from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So that was one of the main objectives of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Obviously, after having made the purchase, Jefferson is who ordered Lewis and Clark to explore the Louisiana Territory. It's really interesting, and I think this gets lost historically. And I think the Lewis and Clark story and the expedition story is one of the great stories in American history. Maybe the most important person on the journey was the teenager Sacagawea, who was actually the wife of a French trapper who was hired by Lewis and Clark to help go across the territory. The trapper's name was Charbonneau, and he was pretty much worthless. But Sacagawea knew the territory. She spoke multiple Native American languages. She picked up English on the way. She was fluent in French. She was comfortable with a certain type of sign language that Native American tribal groups did. It's multiple times. You can count multiple times where Sacagawea really saved the expedition. It's pretty amazing. Um, Question four. Um, there were multiple tribes that Lewis and Clark came in contact with, Native American tribes. One group was called the Nez Perce, which was a nickname, which means pierced nose. The men would pierce their noses. There were other tribes, the Shoshone, the Mandan, that helped Lewis and Clark on the way west. Um, this is ironic in that those tribes probably hastened their own destruction and being placed on reservations by helping Lewis and Clark. They actually sped that process. So there's a certain irony that goes along with that. Um, Jefferson, and this is, and I hope you take some time to read and find some outside resources on Lewis and Clark and the expedition, because it's one of the great American stories. Um, Jefferson was a little disappointed with the expedition upon its return. One, there was no Northwest Passageway. Um, Although Lewis and Clark, and especially Lewis, did just historic work. They created very strong maps. They made it back. Um, Jefferson was disappointed in the amount of time that it took. Jefferson was really pushing on Lewis greatly to get his memoirs and get the reports written. So Jefferson, although pleased that we gained this land, was a little bit disappointed on the reporting back, the time that it took, and that there was no Northwest Passageway. This plays a hand later as we look at the next question: what happened to Lewis after the expedition? When you look at That's kind of sad. It's one of the great tragedies in American history. But what happened to Lewis after the expedition? Lewis, and Jefferson even speaks to this in some of his writing. Lewis uh, suffered from what they called back in the day melancholia, which was probably some form of depression. So Lewis would have these highs and these lows. And during the expedition, he was so busy, literally, I mean, they were moving every day and in some ways even fighting for their survival. Um, Lewis did very well when he was active. So during the expedition, Lewis was doing incredible things. He found multiple species of animals, plants. Again, him and Clark made a very, very accurate map of that region. They came in contact and worked with multiple Native American tribes successfully, and they made their goal. Upon return, Jefferson starts to put a bunch of pressure on Lewis. One other thing is on the end of the expedition, Lewis was actually shot in the backside and had to take a form of morphine. And the great American hero spent the trip back riding on his stomach in a canoe. Once he was back, Lewis started to self-medicate, and as he went on a speaking tour of the United States about the expedition, was drinking pretty heavily. So think about this: based on the depression, based on the pressure, and based on the increased drinking, Lewis starts to feel quite a bit of pressure. Once Jefferson's second term is over, Lewis, who later became the governor of the Louisiana Territory, gets called into question by James Madison, who replaced Jefferson as president, about spending and just exactly how he was managing the Louisiana Purchase. And somewhere on a trip back to Washington, D.C., um, and you can research this. This is one of American history's great mysteries. Um, Lewis was killed, and whether he killed himself, whether, um, whether he was attacked or robbed, whether he accidentally shot himself, we don't know. That's still up for speculation. But the great American hero of the early 1800s ends in a very tragic, tragic story. Now, and this is where we get to it a little bit. How did the purchase and expedition help the U.S. become a world power? Well, upon we double in size, and because the Louisiana Purchase goes to the Pacific Ocean, we are one of the few nations in the world that becomes a bi-coastal nation. So with the Louisiana Purchase, not only do we gain all those territories, we also gain access to New Orleans, which was one of the primary goals also of the expedition, one of the main ports. But now we are a port nation along the Atlantic, along the Gulf of Mexico, and now the Pacific. So not only do we have incredible raw goods and resources, we have the ability to get to ports which can ship those raw goods and resources to the world. And it sets an economic baseline for America that very quickly, as a young nation, starts to set us apart. The other thing is you'll see with the Louisiana Purchase, um, you we've almost gotten rid of all outside interference by 1800, and for sure by 1815. um, there's no more British. We don't have to worry about the French anymore, and pretty quickly after that we don't have to worry about the Spanish. Now, sadly, and by the way, this is one of those situations with American history that we're always dealing with. um, the Louisiana Purchase puts us on the fast track to becoming a world power. Bad. Um, Louisiana Purchase basically is another chapter in what becomes the eventual eradication of Native American peoples in North America. I think with the Louisiana Purchase, it's almost inevitable what's going to happen to the Native American tribal people. And gosh, within 70 years, almost every Native American tribe is on a reservation or wiped out. The other thing is, too, with the Louisiana Purchases, we head west, and always keep this in mind, and this becomes a theme of the second half of this class. As we head west, the question begins to intensify: should we be free or should we be slave? How do you keep that balance between free and slave states as we move westward? And the Louisiana Purchase really speeds that question. So, like everything else in history, there's no good or easy answer. Good news, Louisiana Purchase leads to the United States becoming a world power because of not only all the resources, but the ability to move those resources. Bad news, what happens to the Native American tribal people and the debate over the expansion of slavery. Okay, so some takeaways. Don't forget, Jefferson was what was called a strict constructionist, but to purchase Louisiana, he kind of ignored those strict construction viewpoints and really takes a turn as a loose constructionist, somebody that interprets the Constitution. Two, what a monumental feat it was for Lewis and Clark in Sacagawea to lead the expedition west and successfully pull this off. And then the long term impact. U.S. is a world power. What happens to the Native Americans and the debate over slavery? So think about those pieces as you go over things this week and use these 8 questions and Jefferson's viewpoints kind of as a way to help you with this week's essay questions. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions so I can help you guys out. Okay? Thank you.